the beginning of endless cold long ago. Before history was carved into stone or written on scrolls, the earth went through one of its cruelest periods. There were no cities, no nations, only wind, silence, and survival. It was a world covered in white, a cold, vast, and merciless white. But it wasn't the white of peace. It was the white of hunger, isolation, and death. This was the stage upon which our ancestors walked, with no technology, no safe shelter, no promise of tomorrow. It was the deadliest era in human history, the peak of the last great ice age, a time when the planet itself seemed determined to drive life off its surface, when simply breathing was a triumph, and each sunset might be the last. And yet, in the heart of desolation, something extraordinary happened. Humanity prevailed. Imagine standing in a vast plain where the horizon disappears into snow. The cold isn't just physical. It seeps into your bones, into your soul, into time itself. The wind howls like an invisible predator. Trees are rare, twisted, bent by ice. There are no stores, no easy fire. Every resource must be earned through courage and cleverness. Our ancestors, Homo sapiens, still shared the planet with other human species, Neanderthals and Denisovans. But it wasn't brute strength that saved them. It was something deeper, the mind, the spirit, the ability to imagine, to cooperate, to adapt. They had no certainty, but they had one another, and that, even in silence, was everything. At that time, Earth was not a home. It was a trial. Oceans froze up to their shores. Nights stretched endlessly. Food was scarce. Predators were immense and lethal. And amid it all, small bands of humans fought to survive, hiding in caves, wrapped in animal hides, clinging to a raw, instinctive hope. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when the human race was hanging by a thread, not because of war, but because of weather, not because of hatred, but because of frost. And still, we're here. This is the story of how they made it. How, in the face of a hostile Earth, early humans not only survived, they learned, they created, they taught, and they passed down the spark that would ignite everything we are today. What you're about to discover is not just science, it's a living memory. It's the root of what it means to be human. Now, walk back with me in time. Let's journey through the deadliest era in history and discover how our ancestors with fire, fur, and faith defeated the cold. Part 2. A World Beneath Ice. The planet during the last glacial maximum, the era that tested humanity, wasn't just cold. It was deep, relentless, and crushing. Scientists call it the last glacial maximum. It reached its peak between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, but its grip began long before and lasted for thousands of years. Imagine a planet where the rhythm of the seasons has broken, where summer never truly thaws the ground, where clouds hide the sky for weeks, where what is green today was once white, hard, and lifeless. In North America, massive glaciers swallowed the land. Canada and much of what is now the northern United States lay buried under sheets of ice nearly 3 kilometers thick. In Europe, entire regions were crushed by slow-moving glaciers. Asia, now teeming with life, held frozen steppes and icy deserts. The oceans had receded. So much water was locked in ice that sea levels dropped over 100 meters. What is now the North Sea was once dry land, and between Siberia and Alaska stretched a frozen land bridge, Beringia, across which animals and humans migrated. But that opportunity was deceptive, because the world wasn't just dry and cold. It was hostile in every detail. The wind wasn't a breeze, it was a blade. The rain wasn't water, it was cutting snow. And time felt frozen. Because in a world where nothing melts, even the passage of hours becomes merciless. Little vegetation, little game, little light. It was a prison without bars, and yet it was all that existed. Life as we know it today would have been unthinkable. There was no agriculture, no writing, no metal tool. But there were humans, small, fragile, and yet unbelievably resilient. Caves became shelters, fire became the center of life, and cooperation ceased to be a choice. It became the law of survival. With every sunrise came an unspoken choice, fight or fade. And day after day, through the ice and wind, they chose to fight. The planet seemed to long for eternal silence, but in the midst of cold, isolation, and death, early humans decided to leave a mark. And they did. In the next part, we'll explore who these humans were, how they lived, what they ate, how they slept and hunted, and most of all, how they turned fear into collective intelligence. They had no modern technology, but they carried the seeds of human culture. Part 3. Who they were. The humans of the last frontier before cities were raised, before words were written, before farming was born. There were them, and they were not all the same. During the Ice Age, 3 kinds of humans walked the earth. Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, expanding out of Africa. Neanderthals, stockier, cold adapted, with brains as large as ours. Denisovan, mysterious, known only through fragments, but genetically real. They coexisted. They shared land, interbred, and competed for survival. But over time, one group began to stand out. Homo sapiens, lighter, more adaptable, more communicative. But why? Not because they were the strongest. In fact, Neanderthals were physically more powerful, more resistant to cold. The advantage lay in the mind, in the way they observed patterns, in their ability to imagine the future, to predict herd movements, to recognize safe shelter, to retain and pass on knowledge. They looked at the world and asked questions, and slowly that changed everything. These humans lived in small nomadic bands. They traveled for miles in search of shelter and game. They depended on nature, but were not ruled by it. They crafted stone tools sharp as surgical blades, used bones as levers, hammers, weapons, learned to build shelters from mammoth bones, branches, and hide. More than that, they learned to share, because in a world this hostile, those who shared survived. There were no mirrors, no maps, but there was connection. While the wind screamed outside, they whispered stories within caves. Around fire, they ate, taught, and cared for the sick and elderly. Hunters protected the weak. Children watched and learned. They listened to the snow. They studied footprints. They honored silence. These were real people with real fears, with deep bonds. Men, women, and children who, even without understanding the cycles of the earth, learned to respect its fury. They were not conquering the world. They were just trying to live one more day. But in that simple act, persisting, they altered the course of history. In the next part, we'll dive into the ingenious survival skills of these people, how they built tools, organized group hunts, constructed shelters, and developed clothing to withstand the harshest cold ever recorded. They had no manuals, but they had instinct, experience, and one another. Part 4. The ingenuity of survival. Fire, shelters, and group hunting. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and for early humans, necessity was relentless. Surviving the Ice Age meant reinventing life every single day, and that's exactly what they did. The first great weapon against the cold was fire, but not just for warmth. Fire was life in flames. It cooked tough, frozen meat. It kept predators away at night. It lit caves during weeks without sunlight. And above all, it brought people together. Around the flame, stories were born. It became the heart of the tribe, the sacred core of human gathering. Even more, fire allowed them to process hides, harden spear tips, smoke meat, and even, in some traditions, ward off spirits. But cold wasn't beaten with fire alone. Without natural caves, humans began to build their own shelters, using mammoth bones to create sturdy frames bearing wooden poles, forming primitive tents covering everything, with thick hides of bear, reindeer, or wolf, stitched with tendons and plant fibers, anchoring the structures to frozen ground, stones, or sharpened stakes. Some of these shelters lasted for months, some for entire seasons. They had no architecture, but they had practical intelligence. Clothing was another matter of life and death. Human skin isn't made for -30 or -40-degree weather, so each clothing layer was chosen with purpose. Reindeer hide, light and insulating. For inner layers, bear hide, thick and heavy. For outer protection, hoods, gloves, and double-layered footwear, with dry grass in between. For insulation, every piece was a shield, every knot an invention, every stitch a vow to live. Feeding themselves required even greater ingenuity. Hunting a mammoth or bison wasn't a solo task. It took coordination, ambush strategy, camouflaged traps, and sometimes sacrifice. But when a kill was made, nothing went to waste. Meat fed the group for days. Hide became clothing and shelter bone, turned into tools and structures. Tendons into ropes and cords, marrow and brains provided essential fat to fuel the body against the cold. During brief summers, they added roots, wild berries, and nuts to their diets, storing them in frozen pits, an early form of natural refrigeration. Tools advanced rapidly. Rough flakes of stone became sharp blades. Carefully shaped spears evolved to have composite tips, using resin and sinew to bind flint into bone. Hammers, scrapers, fishhooks, and needles emerged, showing technical thought. They didn't just use what they found, they modified, tested, and improved. This wasn't just adaptation, it was innovation. With every crafted item, every shelter built, early humans were declaring, "We will not vanish." And that silent determination, made of muscle, flame, blood, and thought, kept the human spark alive through the planet's most unforgiving winter. In the next part, we'll explore how this practical ingenuity merged with emotional, symbolic, and spiritual life, because while the body endures, it's the spirit that gives meaning. Part 5, When the Spirit Spoke. Emotion, art, and spirituality in the Ice Age survival was urgent, but to truly live took more than food, shelter, and warmth. Even in the daily struggle, early humans discovered something sacred, the power of the invisible. Around the fire, on starless nights, while the wind howled outside, something would happen. They told stories, they relived hunts, they spoke of the ones who were gone, they imagined tomorrow. And in that simple, profound act, humanity made its greatest leap. They created meaning. This is when we see the first signs of spirituality. Burials with personal objects, carefully placed bones, traces of pigments. These weren't just discarded bodies, they were honored. Why? Maybe intuition, maybe hope, maybe because in a world full of death, believing in something beyond was the only way to keep going. This is also when we see the rise of cave art, paintings in the caves of France, Spain, Indonesia, Siberia, images of bison in motion, human hands, spirals, mythical figures, made with charcoal, red ochre, mineral pigments, applied by fingers, brushes made of hair, or blown through hollow reed. But why paint animals on a wall? Maybe to teach, maybe to summon, or maybe to preserve so that even if the body died, the story would survive. These paintings were not decorations. They were language, they were memory, they were prayer. In a world without writing, without maps or calendars, art was the book. The cave was the library. Oral tradition, the temple. Spoken language became vital. Everything had to be passed down with precision. How to identify poisonous plants, how to build a shelter against the northern wind when the reindeer would migrate where to hide from a blizzard. And that was only possible through attention, repetition, and community. Storytelling wasn't entertainment, it was survival strategy. By now, the body knew what to do, but the soul began to ask why. And in that space between the fear of death and the yearning for meaning, something new was born. The sense of mystery, the impulse to believe, the instinct to remember. And so, even in the harshest environment humanity has ever known, they gave birth to what makes us most human: ritual, memory, beauty, and faith. They didn't just survive, they dreamed. In the next part, we'll explore how these mental and spiritual discoveries helped forge the first foundations of human society: shared responsibility, emotional bonds, the extension of childhood, and a new way of living together. Part 6, the birth of society, trust, bonds, and the strength of the group amid the ice, the constant danger, and the darkness. A new force began to emerge, an invisible force, but more powerful than any tool or shelter: community. To survive alone was impossible, and early humans soon understood that to resist the frozen world, physical strength wasn't enough. They needed to form bonds. Bonds of trust, bonds of care, bonds of survival. It was in this extreme environment that the first structures of organized society began to take form. Small groups, maybe 15 or 20 people, started to live not just as hunters and gatherers, but as extended families, tribes. Each person had a role. Some hunted, others prepared hides. Women cared for the injured and the young. The elders passed down routes, risks, and the cycles of the ice. There were no schools, but there was wisdom, passed through eyes, gestures, and stories. Childhood, for the first time, was allowed to be long, and the elders, far from being discarded, became the guardians of memory. This structure, which we now call society, was forged by scarcity, by hardship, and by the realization that trusting others was survival. It was also in this setting that a powerful concept was born: mutual care, helping the wounded, sharing food, keeping one another warm, protecting the vulnerable. These weren't acts of charity, they were acts of collective endurance. If one fell, all were at risk. If one returned from the hunt, all rejoiced. Cooperation was no longer a virtue, it became an unwritten law. And because of that, emotions, once simple instincts, became bridges: empathy, gratitude, solidarity, grief. Yes, even grief had a place, because when someone died, something broke within the emotional fabric of the group, and that emptiness birthed memory, ritual, and comfort. Society then wasn't built from stone or metal, but from affection, from recognition, from relationship. In the harshest landscape humanity ever endured, something sacred emerged: the idea that we do not walk alone, and that awareness that we belong to something greater than ourselves is the invisible foundation of everything we call civilization. In the next part, we'll see how these early societies began developing symbolic wisdom and cosmic understanding, shaping how they viewed the sky, time, animals, and themselves. Part 7, Worldviews and Ancestral Wisdom. When the sky became a map, when a people looks up at the sky and sees more than stars, something within them has changed. That was one of the invisible milestones of humanity during the Ice Age. the birth of cosmic consciousness. By watching the phases of the moon, the dance of the constellations, the shifting shadows of stones, our ancestors began to realize that even in a frozen and chaotic world, there was rhythm. And where there is rhythm, there is meaning. Where there is repetition, there is the power to foresee. And where there is foresight, there is survival. This is how the sky became an intuitive map, how winds became messages, and how the signs of the earth, migrating animals, changing snow, sprouting herbs, became accumulated wisdom. They had no calendars, but they knew when to hunt, when to rest, when to move. They had no organized religion, but they already had reverence. Every animal carried a symbol. Every cave echoed with the past. Every death marked a threshold. It wasn't superstition. It was ritualized intuition. They sensed there was something beyond, not just life and death, but transition, passing, continuity. This wisdom was built through silence and time, and passed down through gestures, talis, and symbols. That's why cave art wasn't just decorative. It was a code, a prayer, a cry to time itself. We were here. We survived. Remember us. The paintings didn't only show animals, deer, or hands. They revealed inner visions, what one sees with eyes closed, fears, desires, spiritual calls. Many researchers believe the caves where these images were painted were sacred spaces, sites of initiation, rituals, deep stillness, and perhaps they still are. Over time, human groups began to build collective memory, and that memory guided decisions, migrations, seasons, and survival. It lived in the elders' minds, in the dreamer's eyes, in the artist's hands. What began as pure survival was becoming a consciousness of existence, and that consciousness, the sense that we are part of something ancient and eternal, is the seed of all we now call culture, philosophy, spirituality. They left no books, but they gave us the oldest legacy, the instinct to seek meaning. In the next part, we'll see how the Ice Age finally began to retreat, and what remained of the humans who conquered the impossible. Part 8, The Thaw, the end of the Ice Age and the legacy of the survivors. Nothing lasts forever, not even the deepest cold, not even the longest night. After millennia of winter, the planet began to change again. The ice, vast and silent, began to retreat. Glaciers melted, oceans rose, and what had been a white, lifeless desert began to bloom. But it wasn't a sudden event. The end of the Ice Age was a slow process, marked by erratic warming phases. Over thousands of years, winds shifted, rains returned, the soil awakened. Lands once buried beneath 3 kilometers of ice revealed new fertile ground, new paths, new possibilities. But the most important change wasn't in the earth itself. It was in what humans had become. They were no longer just survivors. They were now bearers of living memory, a generation of human beings forged by the impossible, carrying with them the tools, the symbols, and the instincts that would define the species from that point on. During the coldest periods, it's believed that the human population shrank dramatically. Some estimates say there were fewer than 10,000 viable individuals on the planet, but they endured. They spread out, and where once there was only ice, civilization took root. Farming would come later, writing much later still, but everything that made those things possible was already present. Language, social organization, planning, and cooperation, symbolic awareness, faith, memory. They didn't just outlast the climate. They became like the climate, flexible, shifting, constantly adapting. And when the ice retreated, they didn't start from scratch. They carried forward all they had learned: how to care for others, how to be ingenious in chaos, how to turn scarcity into innovation, how to seek meaning even when everything seems meaningless. The Ice Age, though devastating, was an ancestral wound. It shaped their bodies, yes, but above all, it shaped minds and souls that could endure. It wasn't just the world that transformed, it was the human being. In the final part, we'll reflect on what this journey means today. In an age of comfort and abundance, what do we still carry from those who walked upon the ice, and what have we lost? Because the cold may have passed, but the question remains, what will we do with what we've inherited? Part 9. The Inheritance of Ice. What we still carry today, we live surrounded by comfort, technology, and protection. Our homes have solid walls, our bodies warm clothes, our paths digital maps. But what if the cold returned tomorrow? What if everything we rely on disappeared? What would remain? The answer may lie in the oldest layers of our memory, not just in our genes, but in our essence. Even now, we still form communities. We seek belonging. We grieve for our dead. We gather around ideas, around causes, around stories. We still chase fire, only now within. Our tools have changed, but the drive to create remains. Our homes have changed, but the need for emotional shelter persists. Language has evolved, but it still teaches, heals, and saves. What we inherited from those first humans is not visible, but it lives in every act of empathy, and every choice to care, to cooperate, to remember. They walked on ice so we could walk on earth. They dreamed of tomorrow with no guarantee. And now, even in our abundance, we often forget what matters most, because the greatest legacy of the Ice Age wasn't the triumph over cold. It was the discovery of the human soul. At the most brutal point of our existence, when everything said, give up, they whispered, let's go together. And that quiet phrase still echoes today in every home where there is care. In every life saved by someone who chose to share, in every story told to keep memory alive. We did not defeat the ice with weapons. We overcame it with connection, imagination, and faith. And that remains our greatest strength. It always has. If this journey stirred something within you, it's because this story is also yours. Because in some way, the blood running in your veins carries the same fire that once lit up the darkness. If you want to keep exploring these deep memories, these forgotten roots, these truths that time could not erase, subscribe. Here on Origin Primitiva, every video is a calling, a return to who we once were, and a light toward who we might still become. We'll meet again in the next journey.